In 1651, something evil began to spread through the town of Springfield, Massachusetts. At first, it crept in quietly. Healthy cows were found dead in the fields, food discovered rotting in the cellars, and crops were devoured by swarms of insects. But then, the townsfolk began waking in the night and saw apparitions at their beds, and they spoke of curses and strange lights. And then the children began to die. This isolated New England village was seized by a creeping terror, and as the shadows crept closer to the God-fearing, all eyes turned to one household on the edge of town. What followed was one of the most disturbing and least known witchcraft cases in early American history. You're about to hear the chilling true story of Hugh and Mary Parsons, a husband and wife who would accuse each other of consorting with Satan as their family, their neighbors, and their sanity began to unravel. And stay with me until the end, because the final act of their story is darker than anything Springfield could have feared. I'm Peter Laws, and tonight on Into the Fog, we do not just hear of witchcraft. Tonight we sup with the devil in Springfield. I was born and raised in Britain, a small island that centuries ago began sending ships across the world claiming distant lands. And one of the most remarkable colonies they founded was in the so-called New World, America, in a place they named New England. There they found a region that reminded them of home: cool weather, rolling hills, tangled forests, and winding rivers. But no matter how familiar the landscape felt, those settlers were building their homes in wilderness. You know, if you live in or have visited the towns and cities of America, it's something you can easily forget that so much of that land was once a string of untamed rivers and endless forest, which always brought the looming question of who or what might be watching them from within those trees. And as Malcolm Gaskill explores in his brilliant book on this incident, The Ruin of All Witches, it didn't take long for the old world superstitions to take root in the new soil. Because behind every tree, settlers feared that there might not only be wild animals or native tribes, but spirits, demons, or even the devil himself. Well, our story tonight unfolds in one of those settlements, a place called Springfield, around 100 miles inland from the port of Boston. Springfield was just that little bit deeper in the woods, a little more isolated from the coast, which made it feel more exposed to dangers, both natural and supernatural. But as scary as it was, it didn't seem to put everyone off. Like Mary. Our story centers around a woman called Mary. Her maiden name was probably Mary Read, and she was born in 1610 in a place called the Welsh Marches. This wild borderland between England and Wales was steeped in superstition and legend. And by the year 1627, Mary was 17, and she got married to a local man called David Lewis. But by the late 1630s, he'd left her. Maybe it was because she hadn't been able to give birth to a child, or because she was Protestant and he was Catholic. Whatever it was, he abandoned her and did not return. Mary searched for him, though. She walked for hours and hours, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen her husband, but he was long gone. Whether it was from desperation, or a longing for escape, or plain ambition, Mary began to dream of leaving her pain behind. And so when she heard of the British Empire calling for settlers, urging people to cross the sea to the New World, she wondered if that might be her calling too. And so, in the spring of 1640, Mary packed a small bundle and made the epic journey to Bristol, walking for hours and hours so that she might board a ship to America. But as she stood on Bristol Harbor hoping to board a ship, someone recognized her. They were shocked that she was even considering leaving the country. They said it would not be right for a married woman to leave if her husband might still be alive, regardless of the fact that he'd abandoned her. And so, dejected, Mary turned back and trudged the long walk home again. And she must have been pretty worried because time was slipping by. Fewer and fewer boats were leaving for America, and she knew she might miss her chance. That's when a preacher called Reverend Roth came to her aid. He had contacts in the New World and set up a new home for her in New England. And after a 6-week wait, it was decided that her husband was either dead or had chosen to abandon her permanently, which meant she could try her luck at Bristol again. This time, as she walked the creaking boards of the harbour, she was not turned away. And so she stepped onto the gangplank of the high-masted sailing ship and left the soil of England behind. And as her ship set sail and her homeland faded into the mist behind her, she said goodbye to the old world. Mary Parsons had no idea what horrors were waiting for her on the other side of that vast ocean. The crossing was long, grueling, and at times terrifying. In the 17th century, making the journey from England to the New World could take anywhere from 5 to 20 weeks. That's nearly half a year at sea. And the passengers endured cramped, sweltering conditions below deck, lashed by storms and sickness. And of course, they were always vulnerable to pirates looking to attack and plunder a ship filled with the most treasured possessions of its passengers. But superstition followed them too. The sailors watched the sky for seabirds, a good omen, and some nailed red-hot horseshoes to the mast to ward off evil. But when the winds turned foul or disease spread, it wasn't long before someone was blamed. Gaskill writes that when misfortune hit these ships, the fear of witchcraft would surge even at sea. And if tensions ran high enough, it wasn't unheard of passengers to turn on one another, accusing someone of being a witch. And of course, at sea, there were no courts and no appeals. The punishment was simple and brutal. Either throw the accused witch overboard or hack them to death with an axe. Well, after a challenging crossing, Mary laid her eyes on Boston Harbor and she stepped onto the shores of America. And with travel instructions in hand, she made her way south to Dorchester and then journeyed inland, traveling for 5 days by land to reach the small but growing settlement of Springfield. The year was 1641. At the time, Springfield had just 45 residents, so it was little more than a cluster of families on the edge of the unknown. And she took up work as a maid in the home of William Pynchon. That was the town's founder and leader, and she adjusted to the rhythms of frontier life. She attended church twice a week on Sundays and Thursdays, under the watch of Reverend George Moxon. So much of the place reminded her of home. The hills, the rivers, the language, the clothes that people wore, which everyone read the same Bible. Her life continued like this for 3 years. She worked as a maid, attended church, and tried to prove herself as a valued member of the community, even if she didn't have children or wasn't married. But then, by the summer of 1645, Mary's life was about to shift dramatically. New settlers were still crossing the Atlantic, and among the passengers that year was a man named Hugh Parsons. He was a bricklayer by trade. The historical record does not say exactly how Mary and Hugh met, but we know that on Monday the 2nd of June, 1645, Mary approached William Pynchon, the town's leader. She had a request. She explained that her husband, David Lewis, had abandoned her in Wales, and so she wished to be released from that marriage so she could marry again. Pynchon had to pass her case up the chain to the deputy governor of Massachusetts, and a formal decision had to be made, and until then, Mary waited. Weeks turned into months, but by September, Mary went to see Pynchon again when she admitted she had begun to be quite close with Hugh Parsons, close enough that Gaskill speculates she may have already been expecting his child. By October of that year, Mary was officially declared a single woman, and so she and Hugh were married on Monday the 27th of October, 1645. And the people of Springfield gathered for a modest celebration, and from that day on they were husband and wife. They set up home in a modest house near the very edge of town, far closer to the wilderness than most, a place where the darkness already had its eyes on them. Now, as Gaskill points out, barely a month or so into the marriage, Mary was announcing that she was pregnant. And it should have been a moment of joy, but Hugh Parsons was stressed. He was working hard, laying bricks wherever he could, but so much of the money that he earned just disappeared immediately. You see, they were in debt to William Pynchon, who'd helped them set up this new home. And so Hugh was constantly mending and making do with torn clothes and patching up broken tools, stretching supplies that were never enough. And now with Mary pregnant, they would have another mouth to feed. And the pressure began to eat away at their relationship. They weren't the only ones struggling, though. Across the region, tensions were rising. Life on the frontier was hard. Bitter winters, failed harvests, and old resentments bubbled under the surface. Indeed, in December 1645, just 2 months after the Parsons were married, the nearby town of Dorchester passed emergency laws to curb violent conflicts between neighbors. But then, strange events began, which many believed were paranormal. For example, around that time in Boston, witnesses reported the appearance of an enormous rainbow surrounded by strange lights. It was unlike anything they'd seen before. No one could explain it. Some said it was a sign, or perhaps a warning from God. Then in Ipswich, a calf was born, only it had 3 heads. Yet what really put people on edge was the news that came trickling from back home. Across the ocean, back in England, news was spreading of a rising menace: witchcraft. Witchcraft was spreading across the old English counties, with more than 200 men and women arrested. And in this wave of witch trials, a frenzy of confessions filled the courts. Suspects spoke of demonic animals, known as familiars, who came to them at night in the form of pigs and goats, cats, even mice. And the accused described letting these creatures suckle from hidden marks on their bodies. The courts called them witches' teats, which was their way of feeding the dark animal spirits that came from the devil. These stories, carried on ships, were whispered from mouth to mouth in the New World. But if the people of Springfield thought these tales of demonic power were thousands of miles away, they were in for a shock. Because soon news spread that the witches had already taken root in the colonies, particularly in Connecticut and New Haven. There were rumors of heresy, of unnatural works, of acts so depraved they could only come from the devil, stories of sexual crimes, of bestiality. People grew frightened that Satan's agents had arrived in America and were now working their way through the settlements. And then, as if summoned, something even more devastating struck Springfield. The children, they started to die. The cause appeared to be some kind of disease, perhaps marsh fever, later known by the name malaria. And the deaths would have likely been drawn out, terrifying for the family to witness and spiritually loaded for the community. This condition caused vomiting, convulsions, rapid breathing, delirium. It was a prolonged and agonizing decline, and it could well have looked like a curse, like a soul being terrorized and taken. Then, in the summer of 1646, the crops failed. Multitudes of caterpillars descended on the cornfields, stripping them bare. Food supplies dwindled shockingly low, and in a world where every hardship carried spiritual significance, people started to look for a cause. In August, Mary went into labor and gave birth to a daughter, Hannah. But just as 1646 drew to a close, a disturbing sight was seen. The records say that 2 suns were witnessed in the sky over New England. This was viewed by many as a sign of the end times, a warning of impending destruction. And then, not long after, news came from the nearby town of Hartford. A woman called Alice Young had been found guilty of witchcraft and hanged. Hartford is only 30 miles downriver from Springfield. The devil, it appeared, was moving closer and closer. In 1647, not long after their daughter Hannah had taken her first steps, Mary had news. She was pregnant again. But this time, something was wrong. From early on, Mary didn't feel like herself. Her body ached, her energy drained away. And more than anything, she couldn't seem to shake a creeping unease, an invisible pressure like something was watching her or waiting. She was becoming anxious about life and began to withdraw. Her husband, Hugh, didn't see it that way. When he saw her withdrawing, he saw laziness, weakness. In his eyes, Mary was shirking her duties, resting when there were mouths to feed, chores to do, and crucially, debts to repay. He was working himself to the bone, trying to cover the money that was owed to pension. But now Mary was sick, he didn't want to carry the weight of the house as well. That's when the cruelty began. One night, he came home and found Mary asleep by the fire, and he walked over to the hearth and he deliberately doused the flames, plunging the house into bitter coldness. And he tore the blanket from her body, leaving her shivering on the floor. On another occasion, he threw her food to the ground and made her crawl on all fours to pick it up. Life was getting very bleak and miserable in the Parsons home. But then, something began to change in Hugh. He started turning up at his neighbors' doors, uninvited. No purpose, no reason. He just stood in the doorways, peering into neighbors' homes. People tried to be polite, but they couldn't shake the feeling that Hugh Parsons was watching, not just them, but what they owned. Now, of course, maybe he was just jealous of their warmth, their food, their comfort. But for the neighbors, seeing his eager eyes on them felt strange, felt wrong. Well, as spring broke through the snow, Hugh Parsons wandered up to the home of a man called Henry Smith. It was another of his weird, unannounced visits. Henry Smith opened the door to see Hugh Parsons just standing there, and Hugh had a request. He asked could he possibly do some ploughing work to earn a bit of extra money. Smith declined, politely but firmly. He had no need for help. But at this, Hugh's face just dropped, and after a long look, he turned and left. But he was seething with rage that he hadn't been given some work, and that refusal would soon take on a new and terrifying weight. By June 8th, and after a difficult pregnancy, Mary had given birth to their second child, a son named Samuel. Now with another mouth to feed and still crushed by debt, Hugh made a decision. If he couldn't find work, they'd have to accept lodgers into the house. And so a couple named Anthony and Sarah Dorchester moved in. Didn't take long for them to see that something wasn't right. Hugh's cruelty towards Mary was blatant. He mocked her, he belittled her, he treated her like a servant in her own home. But the tension inside the house was only part of the growing storm, because talk of the paranormal was never far away. Out in New Haven, sailors reported seeing a ghost ship drifting along the coast. It moved without anchor or oars, and on the deck, standing beneath the sails, was a pale phantom, motionless, with a sword in its hand pointing it out to sea. But there were more disturbing events. In the earth itself, unnatural things were stirring. Swarms of buzzing brown flies emerged from the soil, crawling up out of the ground. And then came the worst news yet. In Boston, on June 14th, 1648, a midwife named Margaret Jones was hanged for witchcraft. Her crime? It was said that she could strike people with a terrible illness just by touching them. And when examined, the court said they had found a witch's mark, or how they put it, quote, an apparent teat in her secret parts, as fresh as if it had been newly suckled. She denied all charges of witchcraft, but nothing she could say would save her from the noose. She was executed, and her body swayed on the gallows, and everyone saw it. In Springfield, people grew fearful around their fireplaces, more watchful, more suspicious. And Mary Parsons, she became transfixed by this talk of witchcraft. She kept talking about the devil, about his schemes to seduce and destroy. And she warned her neighbors to stay vigilant, that evil often wore a friendly face. And then came a woman called Blanche Bedortha. Blanche was one of the neighbors of the Parsons. She was pregnant at the time when she had an argument with Hugh Parsons. And after this argument was done, Hugh, in a cold voice, said something to her like, "I'll remember you." Blanche and the other neighbors didn't forget those words, and they frantically tried to figure out what did he mean by that. Was he going to cast some sort of spell on her? Well, she got confirmation of that fear, because not long after, Blanche Bedortha was home alone in her dark house, when shimmering from the shadows, a strange light appeared. This light, she said, began to move through the rooms. It wasn't a lantern or a fire, just a floating glow, unnatural and silent. The phenomena of floating lights is a repeated feature of haunted houses and paranormal cases. And with what happened next, she felt like it was a signal that the dark forces were descending on her. You see, a month later, Blanche, now heavily pregnant, woke in the night with a sudden piercing pain in her left breast. The agony spread up through her chest into her neck and shoulder. They found her lying there, writhing in agony with pain. She survived the episode, but as she recovered, she was convinced that she had not suffered a natural illness. It was a curse. Hugh Parsons said he would remember her, and to be in his memory, it turned out, was deadly. Well, that's what the villagers were saying, because others felt attacked by this strange neighbor. For example, a man called William Branch had a visitation from some kind of demonic entity, he said. He lived just a few doors down from Blanche Bedortha, and one night in the spring of 1649, he woke his wife screaming. The room, he said, had just filled up with a blinding light, and standing at the foot of his bed was a small boy, red-faced and silent. And this boy had walked towards him, reached out and touched his chin. And in that instant, Branch felt a scalding pain shoot down his spine, as if boiling water had been poured onto his back. And as the pain exploded, he heard a voice whisper from the air, "It is done, it is done." And then he collapsed. Was Hugh Parsons starting to infest the community with a kind of insidious supernatural power? Well, that's what people began to believe. You see, in another part of town, Sarah Edwards had her own strange encounter with Hugh. He told her that she owed him money, and he wanted to be paid back in milk that would come from her family cow. Sarah just looked at him and said, "No, I'm not giving you any milk." And as she did that, she watched Hugh walk away with that familiar look of frustration and anger on his face. Well, the next time she milked that cow, something was wrong. Instead of the usual 6 pints, she got just 2. And the milk had a reddish tint, like blood had seeped into it. Sarah stared at the bloody bucket in disgust. She didn't need anyone to tell her what had happened. She was convinced. Whatever curse was moving through Springfield, well, its face was starting to look a lot like Hugh Parsons. While the rumors about her husband were swirling through the streets, Mary Parsons was becoming consumed. She could not stop talking about witches, about the devil, about how Lucifer hides in plain sight, creating misfortunes that are, what she said, anything but accidental. But then one day, Mary allowed her obsession to turn into action. She did something that shocked even her closest neighbors. She publicly accused a woman of being a witch. This woman was called Mercy Marshfield. Now, I was in Salem last Halloween, and when you're there and you explore the history of that wonderful and fascinating place, you do get the impression that all it took back then was an accusation of witchcraft and everyone just believed it and went along with it. But that wasn't actually always the case. For example, in a town like Springfield, Mary's claim was not taken lightly. Accusations like that could destroy a life or end it. So when Mary pointed the finger at Mercy, Mary was accused of slander. So this took the matter straight to court. Both women were summoned to appear in a defamation trial. But just before the hearing, something strange happened. Mary approached her neighbor, a man named John Matthews, and made a second accusation. One even more disturbing than the first. This time it wasn't a neighbor she accused. It was her husband. She told Matthews that Hugh Parsons was a witch. She said she'd seen Satan visit him in the deepest ditch of the night. She said she'd lain there in bed in the dark, watching the devil feeding from her husband's body right there in the bed beside her. And as Hugh twisted and cried out in agony, Satan drank him in. Well, when the defamation hearing arrived, Mercy Marshfield stood tall before the court, denying everything. She insisted she was no witch, and that Mary was acting out of vindictiveness, jealousy, or pure madness. The court believed the accused. Mary Parsons, the accuser, was sentenced to receive 20 lashes in a brutal whipping, but she was given a choice. She could avoid the punishment by paying Mercy a fine of £3. Mary took the fine. Now remember, this was money the Parsons family barely had, and it was just adding yet more pressure to a household already cracking. Hugh was furious. To the outside world, they carried on. They cooked, they cleaned, they walked through the streets like everybody else. But the tension inside that house, it had grown toxic. And as autumn crept in, another dreadful presence swept into New England. Smallpox. Smallpox is a highly contagious and deadly disease. For centuries, it was one of the most feared illnesses on Earth, killing up to 30% of those infected and leaving many survivors permanently scarred or blinded. And reports of smallpox deaths began to spread from town to town. People died in Dorchester, in Boston, and in towns and settlements up and down the rivers. The people were burying their friends and family members. In Springfield, Sarah Dorchester, the woman who was lodging in the Parsons' home, fell ill. And Mary tried to care for Sarah as best as she could, but Mary had troubles of her own. You see, she was starting to see frightening supernatural visions. For example, on one evening, as the light faded and the river mist curled through the trees, Mary was walking along the marsh. She was on an errand for Hugh, and she saw something moving through the mist. It was a dog. Not a natural one. This thing was huge. Black and unholy. Its shape wrong. Its eyes glinting in the dark. Mary knew instantly this was no earthly creature. It was a manifestation. A familiar, sent from somewhere far worse than the woods. And so she turned and ran back to the house. She began hearing things in the house too. She claimed that whenever Hugh came home, a strange rumbling noise would echo through the walls, low and inhuman, like something was moving through the wood or the bricks. She was now more convinced than ever her husband had been touched by something demonic. And yet inside that same house, Hugh was starting to wonder if the evil had come from his wife. He looked at her and saw a woman who drained him of energy, who turned neighbors against him, who didn't seem to help to make them money, and who lost the money through accusing others of witchcraft. And he began to wonder if she might be the one drawing spirits into their house. To test this out, one night he demanded that Mary strip off all her clothes so he could inspect her body for witch marks, those strange hidden teats that demons were said to suckle from. Mary refused. She said the demand was obscene. Well, Hugh heard her and didn't press it. But from that night on, they no longer looked at each other like they were husband and wife, but as potential monsters, side by side in bed. One night, long after the fire had dimmed and the house had gone still, Mary rose from her bed. The baby was quiet while the night shadows pressed against the windows. And Hugh, her husband, her accuser, was asleep. And as he snored, she crept towards his side of the bed, slow and silently, her hands trembling slightly as she peeled back the bedclothes, and then she lifted a candle, held the flame close enough to see his bare skin, and she examined every inch of him. in the flickering glow, looking for a mark, for a sign, somewhere the devil might have fed. She found nothing. But the absence of a mark didn't still her mind. If anything, it made her more afraid. Because if the devil had touched her husband, and she claims to have seen that, she truly believed it, then perhaps he had left no sign at all. Perhaps his work was deeper in people. Around this time, their infant son Samuel began to change. He grew pale and quiet. He stopped feeding. They summoned the doctor, who noticed something that filled her and Hugh with dread. The boy's secret parts, as they called them, looked shriveled and unnatural. His body seemed to be withdrawing into itself. And then came the night when Hugh and Mary were woken with a sudden, animalistic scream from the cradle. They both rushed to Samuel and were horrified to see the little one gasping for breath. His body curled in the blankets, his tiny limbs thrashed about. Mary screamed, and Hugh ran out into the street, banging on the doors, and he was sobbing with worry, begging people, "Please, please come, my son, my son." Their neighbor, Sarah Cooley, came rushing to help. She looked down at the child, who was barely alive, and saw what the doctor had seen, that the genitals were deformed. Sarah Cooley said nothing, but in her heart she felt this may well be another sign that this was not an illness. There was witchcraft in this house. Well, little Samuel somehow survived that night, but it had taken a toll. And for a brief, delicate moment, Mary and Hugh seemed to find one another again, drawn together in their shared stress and fear. It's interesting, isn't it, how stress can sometimes push couples apart, but at others it can draw them together. On the final Sunday of September, the couple even walked to church side by side, speaking gently to one another. Mary later said he was pleasing in his demeanor that day, as if the darkness had retreated. It was good to feel connected again. But whatever light had crept in that morning was quickly snuffed out. Because while they were in church, something very strange happened back home. Their lodger, Anthony Dorchester, had been boiling a cow's tongue for food. He left it bubbling and went to church. But when he checked the pot after he got back from the service, the root of the tongue was missing. The root was just gone with no explanation. This story spread like a crack of thunder through the town. Now, a missing cow's tongue could have been just a cooking mishap. But to the frightened and suspicious settlers, it was a symbol, a sign. You see, in folk magic, parts of animals were sometimes used in curses, especially tongues. You see, the tongue represented the power of words, to bless, to curse, to gossip, to accuse. And cutting out or removing the root of a tongue was symbolically tied to silencing someone. This act could be part of a binding spell, to prevent someone speaking against you, to stop gossip and accusations, to block confessions. Surely this was a sign that the Parsons family were trying to stop people from speaking out about them. Well, on the day of the cow tongue, Hugh didn't go home after church. Instead, he lay in the long meadow staring up at the sky, saying nothing. While back at the house, Mary sat alone holding baby Samuel, whose condition was starting to worsen again. But this time he didn't recover. Little Samuel died that day. He was only a few months old. And while Mary sat alone in the house, cradling her dead child, Hugh was still out in the fields, watching the stars. His neighbor, Jonathan Burt, was the one who went to find him, to break the news. And he approached him gently, knowing how distressed Hugh had been just a few days earlier, when Samuel was gasping for breath in the night. Remember, I was talking to you about Hugh sobbing as he hammered on the neighbors' doors. But his reaction this time was really different. Bert broke the news. Your child, he's gone. Yet Hugh barely reacted. There was no crying this time, no collapse. There wasn't even a rush to return home. Instead, he simply turned and walked away. And he went to the house of George Colton. When Colton opened the door, he saw Hugh, who spoke in a tone that felt weirdly casual for what had happened. And Hugh just said, "I hear my child is dead, but I'll cut a pipe of tobacco first before I go home." Sure enough, he started to pack his pipe, slowly and methodically as if nothing had happened. George and his wife Deborah just watched this in silence, though horrified. Now, was Hugh in shock? Was he expressing grief in an unexpected way? Or did he just not care about his son? Or worse still, was he smoking to celebrate a task completed? These were the thoughts that buzzed in their heads. Well, eventually Hugh did return home. He walked through the door and found Mary sitting with Samuel's body, rocking slightly, staring into the gaunt quiet. Gaskill writes this. Reverend Moxon was informed, and the grave digger instructed. Samuel would be buried that same day. Later, Hugh came home and called at the houses of his neighbors, inviting them to his son's funeral. Wrapped in a linen shroud, the tiny body of Samuel Parsons was carried the length of the main street, followed by his parents and mourners. No bell tolled. The town could not yet afford one. At the graveside, Moxon followed the Puritan custom of quiet meditation. There was neither prayer nor sermon. The bundle that was once a life was lowered into the hole and earth shoveled in. Samuel's grave would have its simple memorial, a slab of Welsh slate, as some New Englanders chose, would have been a slice of home for Mary. But these were expensive imports. Her son would have wood, which would blacken and rot, or sandstone quickly weathered away by storms and frosts. Well, after Samuel was buried, it felt as if the town had crossed the line, because the deaths then began to multiply. Only 3 days later, another woman in Springfield, a woman called Sarah Stebbin, died. And not long after that, Sarah Dorchester, the lodger who had seen the darkness inside the Parsons' home, she also passed away. It was starting to get too much, and the town could not ignore their suspicions about Hugh. The eager watching of others' homes, the missing cow's tongue, the rumbling in the walls, the baby with shriveled limbs, the visions, the blood in the milk, the phantom boy in the night, the accusation of his own wife, but in particular his shocking reaction to his son's death. One by one, the townsfolk began saying it loud, not just in whispers, not just by the firelight, but in the open now. Hugh Parsons had to be a witch. Had to be, they said. And worse than that, he murdered his own child with sorcery. In the weeks that followed Samuel's death, Mary Parsons gave birth to her third child, Joshua Parsons. He was born on the 26th of October. And yet all around this new life, the air of Springfield was growing thick with a sense of supernatural threat. Rumors of witchcraft and demonic activity were now spreading all across New England. And what had once been distant whispers from the old world had now taken root in this wild, anxious land. The old folk horrors had crossed the sea. And in the midst of it all, Mary Parsons made a confession. She told neighbors, "My husband has bewitched me." She told them that Hugh could hear every word she said, even when he wasn't there, that he had cursed her, that he had threatened to hit her with firewood, lifting a log as if to strike her. And most chillingly, she said, he cannot abide that anything should be spoken against witches. As she spoke, her voice faltered, her body went still, and then she slipped into a trance. The neighbors tried to rouse her, calling her name, but nothing seemed to work. But then at this point, they'd managed to get a bell for the church, and it started to ring. And the sound broke the air like a crack, and Mary suddenly sat up, finally blinking, and together the group walked towards the building where a sermon was being preached. The preacher, George Moxon, was already at the front. He was calling people to worship. But what happened next was like something out of a waking nightmare. As Moxon spoke, one woman suddenly collapsed and she started writhing on the floor. Her arms flailed, her eyes rolled back, 2 men tried to restrain her as she screamed out, her voice no longer her own. Then another woman dropped to the floor, and another, and their bodies convulsed, and they cried out. Listen to this. They cried out, claiming that mice and rats were crawling around inside their bodies, gnawing at their insides, chewing through their flesh to get out. At this, the room erupted into utter panic. The sermon obviously ground to a halt, and the others could only just watch as the pews filled with the shrieks of the seemingly possessed. Surely the devil had come to Springfield fully now, and he had come through the Parsons' home. Eventually, the whispers grew loud enough that the town's leader, William Pynchon, could no longer ignore them, and he issued a formal warrant for the arrest, but not of Hugh, of Mary Parsons. She was seized from her home and taken into custody, interrogated. But the real test wouldn't come in the daylight. Instead, that night, 2 men from the town were assigned a rather disturbing task. They were to watch her cell until dawn to see if any satanic creatures like mice, cats, snakes, and even flies might creep into the room and suckle from her body in the darkness. Now, when I was in Salem, I saw examples of how small some of these cells could be. Some of them were no bigger than a small toilet cubicle with tall brick walls and heavy barred doors. Just looking into those cells made me feel totally claustrophobic. I cannot imagine what it would be like to be in there. Some of the accused were there for months. I don't know how large Mary's cell was, but she was certainly under lock and key as these 2 men observed her through the night. But what came wasn't a demon, it was testimony. Throughout the night, Mary whispered of Hugh Parsons, his cruelty, his temper, his powers. He said he wasn't just an angry man, he was vengeful, and that he had access to forces far beyond nature. Hugh, she said, had killed their infant son not in grief or madness, but because he wanted Mary to be free to work the maize fields without the burden of caring for a child, and that's why he had killed the boy. Well, the 2 men listened to her accusations through the night, and the next day Mary was brought before William Pynchon, again the leader of the town. But this time, others came forward, friends and neighbors, and one by one they offered their stories to back her up. The strange lights, the cursed milk, the missing tongue. And so the verdict came. Hugh Parsons was to be arrested. They found him, and he was marched through the streets surrounded by guards as the people watched from their doorways and windows. As he went past, one woman, a woman called Ann Stebbins, saw him and cried out, "Ah, witch! Witch!" And then she collapsed on the ground, convulsing in the dirt. That wouldn't be the last of her contact with him, because later that day, Ann Stebbins was at home, just sitting by the fire, when she became fixated on the chimney. She became convinced that something was hiding in the fireplace, crouching somehow up inside the chimney breast. And she said this thing, whatever it was watching her. And so she dropped to all fours and crawled carefully towards the hearth. And with a held breath, she looked up into the darkness and screamed, "There hangs Hugh Parsons!" She said she could see him dangling above her, his body swinging in the blackness. She threw herself backwards, shrieking because she was sure that he was about to fall on top of her. And then she started jerking and shaking. She was possessed by terror. And yet the man she claimed to see was now in chains elsewhere. This idea struck terror into people, the thought that he could still reach them even from his prison cell. Mary Parsons remained under house arrest with her daughter Hannah and her infant son Joshua, while Hugh Parsons stood before the court. And he was forced to answer every accusation that had wrapped itself around his name like a noose. But what troubled the court most deeply was the way he had reacted when his son had died. Now today, we might say he was a man in shock, that his mind had broken under grief, that some part of him had simply shut down. But in 1651, in a courtroom thick with fear and scripture, his lack of weeping was evidence. A man who does not grieve his own in an obvious way, such a man must have no soul left to lose. Meanwhile, back in the Parsons home, the horror hadn't stopped. Because while Hugh stood trial, another death followed. This time their baby boy, Joshua Parsons, died. Had Hugh sent his spirit out to kill the boy? That's not what the community came to believe. You see, they were convinced that Mary herself had murdered the child. It was a shocking accusation, and yet she didn't deny it. The town register recorded the infant's death as murder at the hands of his mother. And so now husband and wife stood accused. And it was a disturbing and frankly depressing sight to see them both vigorously accuse one another in court of witchcraft. With Mary standing accused of murdering her child, Hugh might have felt the tide was turning away from him, but it wasn't, because the court were obsessed with the fact that he hadn't cried or been upset at the death of Samuel. Hugh tried to explain himself. He said to the judges that when his son died, he'd forced himself to stay calm for Mary's sake. He said she was already unraveling and was mentally and spiritually fragile. He said if he allowed his sorrow to overcome him, he believed it would have broken her completely. He said he'd kept his tears hidden to protect her. But also, in a world of stiff collars and unbending faith, he was under the impression that grief was supposed to be silent, stoic. He said he'd feared seeming weak and unmanly in front of his neighbors. So he bit his tongue and swallowed his grief, smoked a pipe instead. In a sense, in that courtroom, he was forced to beg for his grief to be believed. So he asked for witnesses, those who'd seen him that night weeping and frantic, pounding on doors, calling for help when Samuel couldn't breathe. Let them say how I ran, he urged the court. Let them say how I cried out that night. It was too late. Because once the devil's shadow falls on a man, even kindness becomes a trick and every tear could be a lie. That's what they were thinking. The accusations, the testimony, the tangled truth of it all, it just got too complicated, too charged for a small town already splitting at the seams. And so it was decided that the trial would be moved to Boston. And so at sunrise on the 24th of March, 1652, Hugh and Mary were shackled together and loaded onto a cart. Hands that had held each other to dance on their wedding day were now bound and tied. Whatever marriage had once existed between them both had ground down to this. And as they left their home behind, rattling towards a bigger court, the people of Springfield stood back and watched the devil ride out of town. The journey would take them to Boston jail, a place famous even then as a pit of despair, building thick with damp, rot, and the cries of the condemned. And at Boston jail, Mary was put on trial first, and this time the charges were severe. She was accused of witchcraft, of conspiracy with Satan, and of the murder of her own child. In the Boston court, the evidence was grim and was laid out in chilling detail, and the court listened. However, the move to Boston brought a change in perception. The folksy superstitions that had terrified the Springfield residents came across a little less credible here in the city, and people were more skeptical about the witch claims, or at least they wanted stronger proof of witchcraft. And finally, after all the evidence was presented, the jury retired to deliberate. On the count of witchcraft, Mary Parsons was found not guilty. The court said they simply had been insufficient evidence of sorcery. And then came the verdict on infanticide. And on this count, Mary was found guilty. And the sentence was the gallows. The wheels of justice, just like the cart that brought her to Boston and the ship that brought her to America, moved very slowly. She was sent back to jail to await her execution. And there, in that rotting cell, her body began to fail her. Gaskill writes these incredibly poignant words. On a day that passed, unrecorded, sometime between the 13th and 29th of May, she died alone and uncomforted in prison. on a scatter of filthy straw. Mary was in her late 30s, perhaps 40. She hadn't seen her 5-year-old daughter Hannah since she left Springfield 2 months earlier, nor in that time had she seen anyone she knew apart from the few witnesses in the courtroom. The only mercy, though it can hardly have been a consolation, was that she had been spared the ordeal of a sordid, brutal public hanging. What happened to her body we can only guess. She may have been buried within the prison grounds or in some far corner of burying ground in nearby Tremont Street. There she would have been tipped unceremoniously into a pit, her final resting place unmarked, unvisited, unremembered. This was the wretched end of Mary Parsons' arduous journey from the Welsh marches to the American wilderness, through 2 abusive marriages, the loss of 2 babies, and a twisted thicket of delusion, resentment, and remorse. As his wife died, Hugh Parsons was still locked up in Boston jail. He'd lost his home, his wife, his 3 children. For what was left of him? Well, he sat alone in that cell, 3 months into captivity, when finally a decision was made. The court admitted that, yes, there was reason to suspect witchcraft. His behavior had been strange, the testimony disturbing, and the deaths that followed him were worrying, but they said suspicion was not enough. There was no actual proof, no physical evidence, or indeed a devil's mark. And they agreed that it may have all just been down to fear, paranoia, and rumor. And so the local court passed his case up to the general court, and Hugh was sent back to jail, where he remained for 7 more months without trial. He waited, forgotten by most, hated by some. But then at last the wheels of justice turned one last time, and after months in darkness, Hugh Parsons received word. He had been found guilty of witchcraft. But just as the axe seemed ready to fall, a final twist emerged from the court. They re-examined the testimony and saw what now seemed, well, painfully obvious. The primary witness against him was dead. Mary Parsons, his wife, his accuser, was gone. And without her voice, the case began to unravel. And so Hugh Parsons, the man once believed to be in league with the devil, was not hanged. In fact, on the 1st of June 1652, he was released. And after being locked up for 15 horrendous months, Hugh was reunited with his daughter Hannah, who was now 6 years old. They did not return to Springfield, but they stayed in Boston. And eventually he moved to Portsmouth, where life started looking up for him. He managed to acquire some land. He even got married to a widow called Elizabeth. She had daughters, and so Hugh became their stepfather. After a life marked with grief, stress, suspicion, poverty, and horror, Hugh Parsons prospered somewhat. He lived until June 18th, 1685, one of the accused witches in New England to survive the ordeal. After the Parsons case, accusations of witchcraft continued in Springfield. Ironically, the community accused another woman of witchery, and her name was also Mary Parsons. But people, well, they were starting to become a little bit more skeptical of the witch hunts. In 1654, for example, a female witch was hanged from the gallows. But a woman in the crowd, listen to this, a woman in the crowd came up to the hanging corpse, who had been her neighbor, by the way, and she looked under the skirt of the body, and she turned round to the crowd and shouted to everybody, "If these be the marks of a witch, then I'm one, and so are half the women in this town." But far from the skeptical cities, in the quiet rural towns, the fear still pulsed, alive and breathing, that Satan prowled around these settlements like a lion looking for someone to devour. And in 1692, that fear erupted into fire. The Salem Witch Trials would become the most infamous of them all, an echo of Springfield's terror, but louder, grotesque enough so that after Salem, no more witches would ever be hanged again in New England. You know, our lives are built on stories. We like to hear them for entertainment or education. But stories are more pervasive than that. We live a story. Our lives become a journey, a narrative in which we are the main character, working through whatever quest we've chosen. Like Mary Parsons, who after being abandoned by her husband in Wales, saw a new story for herself in the exciting world of America. And yet as we write the stories of our lives, we cannot help but cast the characters. And some are heroes. But there always tends to be a few, or at least one, enemy. For those early settlers in America, their story had an enemy. You see, some of them felt the Native American Indians, with their strange, seemingly blasphemous religion and beliefs, were bad, evil, out to get them. But have you noticed how when we paint our stories, we're not always content with an enemy out there? Sometimes we like to cast them much closer to home. Hugh and Mary Parsons moved to America. It was a choice that took incredible faith, resilience, and courage. And then they found each other in Springfield. And in this backdrop of a new world, before God on their wedding day, they dared hope that they might be writing an exciting new chapter in their combined story. Isn't that what marriage is? Love relationships are? It's a combining of two stories to make one. But for them, the folk tales, the superstitions are always close at hand. So that when the inevitable and brutal stresses of pioneer life came calling, the hardships, well, they came to signify much more than just bad luck. Things got so bad that it seemed that the devil himself was stepping into their story. What I find so affecting about Gaskill's book on Springfield, and so heart-wrenching, is that sometimes we just can't stop ourselves bringing the devil, not only from the woods or out there, but even into our own homes. There are many moments in Gaskill's book that stay with me, but I think the image that haunts me the most is Mary Parsons sneaking up to Hugh's bedside as he sleeps, sneaking a look under the covers to see if he had a witch's mark. And the thought of him doing exactly the same to her, demanding that she strip naked so he might look for a mark on her. The thought of those sorts of exchanges between a couple, a husband and wife, leaves me just so heavy-hearted. Especially when you see where the seeds of those superstitions would lead. The painting of one another as witches would lead to being taken to Boston on the same horse and cart, both probably wondering, how did our story end up here? And for Mary to be tipped into an unmarked grave and forgotten. Heartbreaking. How important it is then to have historians like Gaskill setting out to uncover and unravel these historical stories, which of course become all the more poignant because at some point along the line, and I say this over and over again, we remind ourselves these aren't stories. They're real people. A real man, a real woman, a real house, real children. In 1651, something evil began to spread through the town of Springfield, Massachusetts. And as we leave Springfield behind, perhaps we carry with us a quiet warning that in the stories we write about each other, about friends, strangers, or even the ones we love, it's far too easy to see the devil in someone else's eyes, when all along he may be hiding in the shadows between us, whispering just enough to orchestrate a conjuring trick that can turn our love into hatred. Maybe that's his greatest trick of all. I'm Peter Laws, and you've been listening to The Devil Came to Springfield. Good night.